Apple just made a massive last-minute change to avoid a €500 million fine from the European Union. And if you're using apps on your iPhone or developing them, this affects you directly. So here's what happened. The EU gave Apple an ultimatum. Change your App Store rules by June 26th or face fines that could reach $570 million. With hours to spare, Apple blinked. They completely overhauled how they charge developers in Europe, and the ripple effects are going to be huge. For years, Apple has taken a 30% cut from almost every transaction in the App Store. Buy a game? Apple gets 30%. Subscribe to Spotify through the app? Apple takes their slice. Developers have been screaming about this for over a decade, calling it the Apple tax. But here's where it gets interesting. The European Union just forced Apple to change the game entirely. The new rules are actually pretty straightforward. If you're a developer in the EU and someone buys your app through the App Store, you now pay 20% instead of 30%. That drops to just 13% if you're part of Apple's small business program. But here's the real kicker. If you want to send customers outside the App Store to pay, you only pay Apple between 5 and 15%. Think about what that means. A developer making $1 million a year just got a potential $100,000 raise. That's not pocket change. But why did Apple cave? It all comes down to something called the Digital Markets Act. The EU basically said, look, you can't force developers to only use your payment system and then charge them massive fees for the privilege. That's anti-competitive. Either let them use other payment options or we're going to make your life very difficult. And when the EU says difficult, they mean it. The initial fine was set at €500 million, but that was just the appetizer. If Apple hadn't complied by the deadline, the fines could have escalated to 5% of their daily global revenue. We're talking about potentially billions of dollars. Now, Apple didn't go down without a fight. In their statement, they said they disagree with this outcome and plan to appeal. But they still made the changes, because the alternative was watching money hemorrhage out of their accounts while lawyers argued in court. What's fascinating is that this isn't happening in isolation. There's a bigger chess game being played here between the United States and Europe over who gets to regulate big tech. President Trump actually called these EU fines overseas extortion and threatened to slap tariffs on Europe in response. He even signed an executive order called Defending American Companies and Innovators from Overseas Extortion and Unfair Fines and Penalties. The timing couldn't be more dramatic. This all went down while Trump was heading to Europe for a NATO summit with a major trade deadline looming on July 9th. It's like watching two superpowers arm wrestle over who controls the internet. But let's get back to what this actually means for you and me. If you're a developer, especially a smaller one, this is potentially game-changing. That extra 10 to 15% you get to keep could be the difference between hiring another programmer or keeping the lights on for another year. For indie developers who've been squeezed by Apple's fees, this is like getting a surprise bonus. For users, the effects might be more subtle, but still significant. When developers keep more money, they can invest more in their apps. Better features, more frequent updates, maybe even lower prices. Some developers might pass the savings directly to consumers. Imagine if your favorite subscription app suddenly cost 10% less because they didn't have to pay Apple as much. But here's where it gets complicated. These changes only apply in the European Union. If you're a developer or user in the United States, Japan, or anywhere else, you're still playing by the old rules. Apple is essentially being forced to run two different app stores, one for Europe with these new, more developer-friendly terms, and one for everyone else with the traditional fees. This creates a weird situation. A developer in Berlin pays less to Apple than a developer in Boston for doing the exact same thing. It's like having different prices at McDonald's depending on which state you're in, except the price difference is mandated by law. The really interesting part is what Apple didn't change. They're still requiring developers to go through their app review process. They still control what apps can and can't do on the iPhone. They've given ground on payments, but they're holding the line on control. It's like they're saying, fine, we'll take less money, but this is still our house and our rules. And Apple's not the only one in the hot seat. Meta just got hit with a €200 million fine for their advertising practices. The EU is basically telling American tech companies that if you want to do business in Europe, you play by European rules. No exceptions, no matter how big you are. What makes this even more complex is something called the core technology fee. Even with these new lower percentages, Apple introduced a fee of 50 cents for every app install over 1 million. So if your app goes viral in Europe, you could end up owing Apple hundreds of thousands of euros just for people downloading your free app. It's like Apple is saying, we'll lower our commission, but we're going to get paid one way or another. Developers are already strategizing about how to handle this. Some are considering creating separate European versions of their apps. Others are wondering if they should just eat the costs or try to pass them on to users. It's creating a whole new layer of complexity in an already complicated business. The European Commission isn't done either. They've indicated they'll be watching closely to see if Apple's changes actually comply with the spirit of the law, not just the letter. If they decide Apple is still being anti-competitive, the fines could start flowing again. This whole situation is a perfect example of how technology regulation is becoming a major battlefield. On one side, you have companies like Apple arguing they built the platform, they maintain it, they deserve to be compensated. On the other side, you have regulators saying that when you control access to 1 billion users, you can't abuse that power. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Apple does provide value. They review apps for safety, handle payments securely, and give developers access to incredible tools. But 30% for every transaction, forever? That's harder to justify, especially when you're already one of the most profitable companies in human history. What happens next could reshape the entire app economy. If Apple's appeal fails and these rules stick, other countries might follow Europe's lead. Imagine if the United States, China, or India implemented similar rules. Apple's entire business model for services would need to change. For now, though, we're in this weird transition period. Apple is complying under protest, developers are trying to figure out what it means for them, and users are mostly unaware that anything has changed. But make no mistake, this is a watershed moment. The walled garden just got its first major crack. The next few months will be crucial. Will developers actually use these new options? Will users notice any difference? Will Apple find creative ways to maintain their revenue despite the lower percentages? And most importantly, will other countries follow Europe's lead? What do you think about all this? Are these fees fair, or is Europe overreaching? Let me know in the comments. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video.